In the summer of 1764, four brothers stood on a Newport dock watching a ship prepare to sail. The vessel was called the Sally, a 100-ton brigantine loaded with over 17,000 gallons of rum. Captain Esek Hopkins commanded the crew. The ship was bound for the coast of West Africa to trade that rum for human beings. The four men watching were Nicholas, Joseph, John, and Moses Brown, members of Providence's most prominent merchant family. They had invested everything in this voyage. If successful, it would establish Providence as a major slave trading port, rivaling Newport's dominance. The profits would be extraordinary. 13 months later, the Sally limped into Antigua in the Caribbean. Of the 196 Africans Captain Hopkins had acquired, at least 109 were dead. Some had died in a failed rebellion. Others starved themselves. Many succumbed to disease in the ship's fetid hold. One woman hanged herself below deck rather than face what awaited her. The Sally was a financial disaster, but its human cost would prove even more significant. The voyage would split the Brown family apart, turn brother against brother, and create one of early America's most bitter debates about slavery. A debate that would play out in newspapers, courtrooms, and the halls of Congress. This is the story of Nicholas and John Brown, and of the ship that changed everything. The Brown family's story begins long before the Sally. It starts with Chad Brown, one of the co-founders of Providence alongside Roger Williams in the 1630s. Chad Brown was an early Baptist minister, helping establish the first Baptist church in America. His descendants would build one of colonial Rhode Island's great merchant dynasties. By the early 18th century, the Browns were firmly established in Providence's commercial life. James Brown, born in 1698, expanded the family enterprises significantly. In 1725, he began sailing to the West Indies as captain of his new ship, the Four Bachelors. This brought the Browns into what was called the triangular trade. The system worked like this. Ships carried rum from Rhode Island to Africa, where it was traded for enslaved people. Those enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and sold to plantation owners. The ships returned to Rhode Island loaded with sugar and molasses, which was distilled into rum to begin the cycle again. The profits were immense. So were the risks. But James Brown prospered. Within a few years, he owned several sloops, built a distillery, operated a slaughterhouse. His younger brother Obadiah built a chocolate factory. The Brown family fortune was growing, built on trade, manufacturing, and increasingly on slavery. When James Brown died in 1739 at age 41, he left behind a widow, Hope Power Brown, and 6 children. The 4 surviving sons would become known throughout Rhode Island. Nicholas, born 1729, Joseph, born 1733, John, born 1736, and Moses, born 1738. Some wit in the 20th century would call them Nick, Joe, Jack, and Mo. But there was nothing light-hearted about what they would build, or what they would fight over. Uncle Obadiah took charge of training his nephews in the family businesses. He taught them accounting, negotiation, shipping logistics, the intricacies of Caribbean trade. Each brother grew up surrounded by the machinery of commerce, and each brother grew up in a household where enslaved people worked in the kitchen and nursery. This was normal in colonial Rhode Island. Slavery was an accepted part of everyday life. The Browns owned enslaved people who tended their homes, worked in their businesses, served their needs. Moses Brown's household records from 1764 list several enslaved men. Bono, about 25 years old, Caesar, recently purchased at age 23, and Cudjoe, born in Rhode Island to African parents. At least one enslaved woman, Eve, lived in the household. When Obadiah died in 1762, the brothers formed a partnership, Nicholas Brown and Company. Nicholas, the eldest surviving brother, was 29 years old when he inherited leadership of the firm. He had delayed marriage until age 33, dedicating himself first to establishing the business. The firm included maritime trade along the eastern seaboard, trade with the Caribbean and England, a rum distillery, spermaceti candle manufacturing from whale oil, and an iron foundry called the Hope Furnace. Nicholas was methodical, careful, strategic. Joseph was intellectually curious. He would later design the college edifice for what would become Brown University and serve as professor of natural philosophy. Moses, the youngest, was still finding his way, learning the business, establishing himself. And then there was John. John Brown, born January 27, 1736, was different from his brothers. As a young boy, he wrote in his cipher book, his practice book for penmanship and arithmetic, "John Brown, the cleverest boy in Providencetown." That confidence, that self-assurance, would define his entire life. He was ambitious, daring, willing to take risks that made his more cautious brothers nervous. By 1764, all four brothers were involved in Nicholas Brown and Company. They were diversifying, expanding, looking for new opportunities, and they kept hearing about the enormous profits being made in the slave trade. Newport dominated Rhode Island's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. In the years following the French and Indian War, vessels from Newport carried more than 70% of the American traffic in enslaved Africans. While colonial carriers remained a small fraction of European ships in the trade, the American business was located almost exclusively at Newport. The numbers were climbing. In 1759, only 6 ships cleared Newport for Africa. By 1761, that number had more than doubled to 15. By 1764, the year the Browns dispatched the Sally, over 20 ships sailed from Newport to Africa. Providence merchants watched enviously. The Brown brothers, along with Rhode Island Governor Stephen Hopkins, wanted to make Providence the political and commercial center of the colony. The slave trade represented both profit and prestige. If they could succeed, they could challenge Newport's dominance. In the summer of 1764, the brothers made their decision. They would finance a slaving voyage. The preparations were extensive. The Sally needed to be outfitted with everything required for a voyage that could last over a year. Local Rhode Island merchants contributed supplies. John Brown kept detailed records of what went aboard. 17,274 gallons of rum, the main currency of the Rhode Island slave trade, 1,800 bunches of onions for preventing scurvy, 90 pounds of coffee, 40 barrels of flour, 30 boxes of spermaceti candles from the family's own works, 25 casks of rice, 10 hogsheads of tobacco, 6 barrels of tar, and bread, molasses, beef, and pork. But the ship also carried items specifically for the slave trade. The inventory included 40 handguns, 40 shackles, and 7 swivel guns, small cannons that could be turned inward toward the deck to suppress rebellion. The Sally was being transformed into a floating prison. For captain, the brothers hired Esek Hopkins, an experienced ship captain, but someone without specific knowledge of the African slave trade. He wasn't even their first choice. Many Rhode Island captains were already on the African coast. But Hopkins agreed to command for £50 a month, slightly less than the first and second mates. He was also promised a privilege, a bonus of 10 barrels of rum and 10 enslaved people for himself. The brothers agreed to pay similar commissions to the crew. Most Rhode Island captains received 4 enslaved people as bonus for every 104 sold at market. Because hard money was scarce in Rhode Island, crew members were also offered enslaved people as payment. The first and second mates would each receive their own human beings as compensation. In September 1764, John and Moses sailed with their brother Joseph from Providence to Newport to supervise final preparations. Nicholas stayed behind in Providence, managing affairs at the counting house, as was his habit. The brothers wanted everything perfect. The stakes were high. On a September day in 1764, the Sally cleared Newport Harbor bound for West Africa. The voyage was expected to take a year or more. The brothers waited for word. What happened next is documented in extraordinary detail. Captain Hopkins kept meticulous records, account books, cargo lists, daily logs. These documents survived and are now preserved at the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University and the Rhode Island Historical Society. They provide a window into the Sally's voyage and into the horror of the slave trade. Hopkins spent 9 months on the African coast. This was an exceptionally long time for a slave ship to remain off Africa. The delay meant suffering for everyone confined below decks. Hopkins bartered with various African traders, moving along the coast, gradually assembling his human cargo. Competition was fierce. The end of the 7 Years' War had brought a surge of British and New England ships to Africa's slave castles, trade forts, and river mouths. Hopkins struggled to complete his purchases. Eventually, he acquired 196 Africans. But 19 died before the ship even sailed for the Caribbean. Several were children. One woman hanged herself between decks, choosing death over the horror she faced. On August 20th, 1765, the Sally finally left the African coast, heading across the Atlantic toward the Caribbean. Hopkins had chained the men together in pairs and confined them below deck in cramped, dark, humid quarters, where they struggled to breathe and couldn't even sit upright. The women, mostly naked, lived unchained on the quarterdeck. The crew believed women were less likely to stage rebellion. On August 21st, just 1 day into the Atlantic crossing, a young girl died. She was listed as number 21 inches in Hopkins's grim ledger. Then, on August 28th, just 8 days after leaving Africa, everything went catastrophically wrong. Hopkins had freed some of the enslaved men to help with chores on deck. They seized the moment. A rebellion erupted. The enslaved Africans fought for their freedom. But the crew was ready. They turned the swivel guns inward and fired into the crowd on deck. 8 people died immediately in the gunfire. The rebellion failed. But its consequences stretched across the rest of the voyage. As Hopkins later wrote to his owners, the rebellion made us confine the rest more close, which gave them a bad turn in the head. Numbers starved themselves, all lost their spirits and became very sickly, and some died without being sick. Hopkins opened a special log to track deaths. The entries proceed in numbing regularity. August 30th, a boy and a girl died. August 31st, a woman died. September 1st, 2 more died, bringing the total to 37. Day after day after day, the dying continued. The confinement after the rebellion, the trauma, the disease, the despair, all combined to create a death ship. Some people starved themselves rather than continue living. Others simply gave up, dying without apparent physical illness. By the time the Sally reached Antigua in the Caribbean, at least 109 of the 196 Africans Hopkins had acquired were dead. More than half the human cargo had perished. The survivors were auctioned in Antigua. They were sickly, emaciated, traumatized. They commanded very low prices. Of the 61 captives for whom sale records survive, only 2 were marketed as prime slaves, selling for £50 each. Others sold for as little as £5, an indication of their desperate physical condition. One of the slave traders handling the sales wrote to the Browns expressing condolences. "I am truly sorry for the bad voyage. Had the Negroes been young and healthy, I should have been able to sell them pretty well." For the Brown brothers, the Sally was a financial disaster. They had invested everything and lost most of it. Letters flew between Newport and Providence. Nicholas wrote to his brothers proposing that they plant a false story in the local press about the depressed state of the rum trade on the Guinea coast, hoping to discourage other Rhode Island merchants from competing with future ventures. But there would be no future ventures, at least not together. The Sally had exposed the brothers to the full horror of the slave trade in a way that abstract accounting never could. The death toll of 109 people could not be ignored or rationalized away. For 3 of the brothers, Nicholas, Joseph, and Moses, the Sally was enough. They decided to quit the slave trade entirely. Nicholas would continue other mercantile activities, but never again finance a slaving voyage. Joseph felt the same. And Moses? The Sally affected him most profoundly of all. He would later write that if the Sally had never sailed, I should have been preserved from an evil which has given me the most uneasiness, and has left the greatest impression and stain upon my own mind of any, if not all, my other conduct in life. But John Brown saw things differently. For John, the Sally was a business failure, not a moral catastrophe. The deaths were regrettable, but that was the nature of the trade. Others were making fortunes shipping Africans across the Atlantic. Why shouldn't he? In 1769, 5 years after the Sally disaster, John Brown outfitted another slave ship to Africa. He went into business on his own account, without his brothers. Between 1769 and his death in 1803, John would finance at least 4 more slaving voyages. The trade was never at the center of his business. He remained primarily a merchant dealing in other goods, but he continued participating when opportunities arose. The family dynamic changed forever. The 4 brothers who had worked together, who had jointly founded and supported the College of Rhode Island, who had built Providence's commercial power, they now found themselves on opposite sides of one of the era's defining moral questions. Meanwhile, Moses Brown was undergoing a transformation. In 1773, personal tragedy struck. His wife Anna, who was also his first cousin, died along with one of their daughters. The loss devastated Moses. In his grief, he turned to the spiritual beliefs of the Quakers. The Society of Friends, as Quakers called themselves, had been among the first religious groups to question slavery. In 1773, the same year Moses lost his wife, Quakers asked members to free their enslaved people. Some refused and were disowned by the group. But Moses embraced the call. He invited family members and several Quakers to witness his declaration. Whereas I am clearly convinced that the buying and selling of men of what, Color soever as slaves is contrary to the divine mind, I do therefore. He freed the 6 enslaved people he owned, and relinquished his interest in 4 others who worked at the family's candle works. By the time of the American Revolution, Moses Brown had become Rhode Island's most important anti-slavery leader. He was instrumental in enacting Rhode Island's Gradual Abolition Act of 1784, one of the first such laws in America. The act provided that children born to enslaved mothers after March 1, 1784, would be free when they reached adulthood, men at age 21, women at 18. But Moses wasn't satisfied with gradual abolition. In 1787, he helped pass a state law prohibiting Rhode Islanders from participating in the slave trade. It was a stunning achievement. Rhode Island, which had dominated the northern slave trade, now outlawed it. The problem was enforcement. When state authorities proved unable or unwilling to enforce the law, Moses founded the Providence Abolition Society in 1789. The organization was dedicated to bringing prosecutions against those who continued trafficking in enslaved people illegally. John Brown watched these developments with mounting fury. His brother was attempting to destroy a trade that John considered perfectly legitimate. And Moses's campaigns were having effects beyond Rhode Island. They were contributing to federal action. In 1794, Congress passed the Slave Trade Act, prohibiting Americans from trafficking enslaved people to foreign ports. The U.S. Constitution protected the importation of enslaved people into American ports until 1807, but Americans could no longer legally transport enslaved people to other countries. John Brown ignored the new law. In 1795, he dispatched the ship Hope to the Gold Coast of Africa. The voyage proved profitable. Of the 229 Africans loaded onto the ship, 198 survived to be sold in Cuba. The Providence Abolition Society, Moses's organization, learned of the voyage and brought a prosecution. Brother was prosecuting brother in federal court. The case provoked extraordinary correspondence between John and Moses. Moses urged John to settle, to admit wrongdoing, to stop participating in the slave trade. John refused. In a letter dated March 15, 1797, Moses expressed his deep distress at John's action, accusing him of mounting the voyage specifically to test the strength of the new federal law. John's letters reveal his worldview with stark clarity. He vacillated between self-righteousness and self-pity. In one letter to Moses dated July 29, 1797, John accused Moses and the Providence Abolition Society of vindictively singling him out for prosecution while ignoring others more deeply involved in the trade. In November 1786, John had written Moses a lengthy defense of slavery. He argued that great numbers of the slaves are positively better off than those who are left behind in Africa. He told Moses that when he became convinced, as you are, that it's wrong in the sight of God, I will immediately desist. He predicted, correctly as it turned out, that laws would eventually prohibit the trade, and said he would willingly give up his seat in the legislature to Moses. He concluded, Our different sentiments respecting the guinea trade will weigh nothing in my mind against your taking my place in the House. He signed the letter, Your affectionate brother. John also defended slavery publicly. Writing under the pseudonym A Citizen in the February 14, 1789 issue of the Providence Gazette, John denounced the Providence Abolition Society as an evil combination of religious fanatics bent on ruining him and the whole economy of Rhode Island. In a follow-up letter on March the 14th, 1789, a citizen defended the slave trade explicitly. The writer, everyone knew it was John Brown, argued that the traffic was right, just, and lawful, practiced by the very best men in Rhode Island. Those the abolitionists called Negro dealers and kidnappers were actually upstanding citizens whose property rights were being violated. Moses and other abolitionists responded in newspapers, accusing John and other slavery defenders of being selfish, ignorant, and pitiful. The trial began in Newport in 1797. John Brown became the first Rhode Islander, and possibly the first American, prosecuted in federal court for illegal slave trading. The trial was a disaster for the abolitionists. Though the ship Hope was forfeited, John Brown was acquitted of criminal charges in the jury trial. Moses attributed the acquittal to the peculiar turn of the Newport jury, suggesting jury tampering or favoritism. Indeed, the circumstances were suspicious. The presiding judge, Benjamin Bourne, and the federal prosecutor, Ray Green, were both longtime allies of John Brown. They had served together on the corporation of the College of Rhode Island. While neither appears to have been personally involved in the slave trade, both had close family ties to the trading community. The verdict devastated the Providence Abolition Society, which went into rapid decline. John Brown walked free and continued his business activities without hindrance. But the conflict wasn't over. In 1798, another prosecution was brought against John, which he also beat. Then, in 1799, something more sinister happened. Samuel Bosworth was the surveyor of the port of Bristol. When a slave ship was scheduled for auction, Bosworth intended to attend and ensure proper procedures were followed. John Brown and several associates personally visited Bosworth, warning him not to take part in the auction. Bosworth ignored the thinly veiled threats. The next morning, as he walked to the auction, he was kidnapped. This federal employee was seized in broad daylight and deposited 2 miles down the bay. The kidnapping effectively intimidated federal officials. Local enforcement of the Slave Trade Act essentially ceased. Rhode Island slave traders continued their business, knowing that men like John Brown would use any means necessary, including violence, to protect their interests. The Brown brothers continued their lives despite their profound disagreements. They remained involved in civic life. Nicholas served in the Rhode Island legislature and became a civic leader, funding Providence streets, a library, a market house, the First Baptist Church, a fire engine. During the Revolution, he speculated in war bonds, supplied the Continental Army with gunpowder and foodstuffs, transformed the Hope Furnace into cannon works. John was active in the American Revolution. In 1772, he was one of the instigators of the Gaspee Affair, one of the first violent acts of defiance against British authority. When HMS Gaspee ran aground near Providence while pursuing an American ship, John Brown helped organize a raid. Colonists boarded the vessel, wounded the captain, and burned the ship. It was a precursor to the Boston Tea Party, an early step toward revolution. In 1775, John sold the Continental Navy its first ship, the USS Providence. He invested heavily in privateers during the war, profiting handsomely. In 1787, he sent the General Washington to Canton, becoming the first Rhode Island merchant to break into the lucrative China trade. In 1791, John founded Providence Bank, the first bank in Rhode Island. The bank would eventually evolve over 160 years into Fleet Boston Financial, which was absorbed by Bank of America in 2004. The original Providence Bank building, built in 1774, still stands at 50 South Main Street in Providence. Between 1786 and 1788, John commissioned construction of an elegant mansion at 52 Power Street in Providence. He sent his son and son-in-law to travel the eastern seaboard, measuring the homes of other wealthy men to ensure his own house would be the finest. George Washington visited and reportedly rode in one of John Brown's horse-driven carriages. The house dominated College Hill, commanding views of the waterfront where Brown's ships came and went. It was designed to communicate status, power, and wealth. Every detail, from the grand wraparound stairways to the finely crafted ornamental archways to the gilded and painted wallpaper, was calculated to impress. John Quincy Adams would later visit and call it the most magnificent and elegant private mansion I have ever seen on the continent. Meanwhile, Moses turned to industry. In 1788, he embarked on a textile venture with his cousin Smith Brown and his future son-in-law William Almy. Moses became interested in recent British attempts to use water power in textile mills. He hired English immigrant Samuel Slater to help build a similar mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. In 1793, the factory became the first water-powered spinning mill in the United States, a seminal event generally considered the birth of the American Industrial Revolution. The firm of Almy, Brown, and Slater would help transform American manufacturing. There's bitter irony in this. Moses Brown, the abolitionist who freed his enslaved workers, became instrumental in founding an industry that would depend entirely on cotton produced by enslaved people in the Deep South. The textile mills of New England would consume vast quantities of cotton picked by enslaved hands. Moses helped create the infrastructure that would make Southern slavery even more profitable and entrenched. Did Moses recognize this contradiction? His papers don't say. He withdrew from active involvement in the textile firm but remained a partner. He shifted to agricultural experiments, helped found the Rhode Island Agricultural Society, served on the board of Providence Bank, advocated for sanitation during the yellow fever epidemic of 1797, introduced smallpox vaccination to Rhode Island. The four brothers who had jointly founded the College of Rhode Island remained involved with the institution even as their relationships fractured. Nicholas was one of the college's original incorporators. Moses led the campaign to move the campus from Warren to Providence. Joseph, an amateur architect, designed the college edifice, the main building. John laid the cornerstone in 1770 and served as treasurer for 21 years, from 1775 to 1796. An antique grandfather clock stands in University Hall at Brown University today. It's the family clock of Admiral Esek Hopkins, captain of the slave ship Sally. Hopkins went on to become the first commander-in-chief of the United States Navy during the Revolution. His granddaughter presented the clock to the university in 1855. It sits there still, a reminder of connections many would prefer to forget. 4 enslaved people from the Sally were brought back to Rhode Island by the Brown family for personal use. These individuals were instrumental in constructing buildings on what would become Brown University's campus, including University Hall itself. In 1804, the College of Rhode Island changed its name to Brown University, recognizing a gift from Nicholas Brown, Jr., Nicholas Sr.'s son. The family name would forever be associated with one of America's finest educational institutions. But that name was built on wealth generated by the slave trade, by rum distilleries that used Caribbean sugar produced by enslaved labor, by ships that carried human cargo across the Atlantic. Nicholas Brown died on May 29, 1791, at age 61. Joseph had died in 1785. In a letter dated December 3, 1785, John wrote to his children about Joseph's death, describing how Joseph died in a room crowded with his family and friends, including brothers Nico and Moses. But John admitted in that same letter that there was a breach among the 4 brothers which have so long survived. 20 years after the Sally, the brothers' differences remained. Yet they came together in times of hardship. The bond of family endured even as their convictions clashed. John Brown died on September 20th, 1803, at age 67. His mansion on Power Street stood as testament to his success. His business interests, shipping, real estate speculation, banking, the China trade, had made him one of America's wealthiest men. He had served in the Continental Congress from 1784 to 1785, and as a United States representative from 1799 to 1801. He never expressed regret about the slave trade. He defended it to his death. Moses Brown outlived them all. He died on September 6, 1836, just a few weeks before his 98th birthday. He had remained mentally alert and passionately opposed to slavery until the end. A year before his death, Moses summoned his attorney and added a codicil to his will, leaving $500 to the Providence branch of the American Anti-Slavery Society to publish such manuscripts and pamphlets as the society may judge most useful for abolishing slavery. Moses lived long enough to see significant change. The federal government had banned the international slave trade in 1807, though illegal voyages continued for years. Several northern states had abolished slavery entirely, but the institution remained deeply entrenched in the South, and would for another generation. Moses didn't live quite long enough to see the end. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was ratified in 1865, 29 years after his death. Today, the Sally's legacy continues to resonate. In 2006, Brown University became the first American university to publicly examine and report on its historical ties to slavery. The resulting document, Slavery and Justice, report of the Brown University Steering Committee on Slavery and Justice, provided unprecedented detail about the university's connections to the slave trade. The report documented how Brown's founding families profited from slavery, how enslaved people helped construct campus buildings, how the institution benefited from wealth generated by the triangular trade. It was an act of institutional honesty rare in American higher education. In 2012, Brown established the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, dedicated to understanding slavery's legacies and continuing impacts. The center conducts research, sponsors public programs, and works to connect historical knowledge with contemporary challenges. The records of the Sally voyage are now fully digitized and available online through Brown University's digital repository. Every receipt, every letter, every entry in Captain Hopkins's grim death ledger can be viewed by anyone. The transparency is intentional, making visible what was hidden, giving names and details to what was abstract. John Brown's mansion at 52 Power Street is now the John Brown House Museum, operated by the Rhode Island Historical Society. Visitors can walk through the elegant rooms, admire the architecture, see George Washington's carriage. But the museum also confronts the source of that wealth. Information panels discuss Brown's slave trading, his conflict with Moses, the Sally voyage. The story of Nicholas and John Brown, of Moses's transformation and John's defiance raises questions that remain urgent today. How do we reckon with founders who built institutions through morally compromised means? Brown University bears the family name. The wealth that funded its establishment came partly from slave trading. Does that taint the institution permanently? Or can honest confrontation with history allow for redemption and growth? How do we understand the capacity for family members to hold such radically different moral positions? Moses and John were raised in the same household, trained in the same business, exposed to the same realities. Yet they reached opposite conclusions about slavery's morality. Moses saw it as evil that had stained his conscience. John saw it as legitimate commerce. What accounts for such divergence? The Sally's death toll, 109 people out of 196, represents one of the deadliest slaving voyages in Rhode Island history. But it was far from unusual. The conditions that killed so many on the Sally were standard on slave ships. The cramped holds, the chains, the disease, the despair. This was how the trade worked. The Sally was exceptional only in being so well documented. Rhode Islanders mounted over 1,000 slaving voyages in the century before 1807, carrying roughly 100,000 Africans into New World slavery. Most went into the Caribbean, where they would work on sugar plantations until they died, generally within a few years. Their labor produced the sugar that was shipped to Rhode Island and distilled into rum. That rum went back to Africa to purchase more people. The cycle continued for generations. John Brown participated in this system without apparent moral qualms. He saw it as economically rational, legally sanctioned, practiced by respectable men throughout the Atlantic world. When abolitionists challenged it, he perceived them as fanatical, as threats to property rights and economic freedom. Moses Brown came to see the system as fundamentally evil. The Sally had shown him the human cost in a way he couldn't rationalize away. The memory of that voyage haunted him for decades. He dedicated the second half of his life to fighting what the first half had helped perpetuate. Nicholas and Joseph took a middle path, withdrawing from the slave trade after the Sally, but not becoming active abolitionists like Moses. They simply decided they wanted no more part of it. They would make their fortunes other ways. The brothers' relationships remained complex until the end. Despite their breach, they came together for family occasions. They remained business partners in some ventures even as they clashed in others. John continued signing his letters to Moses, "Your affectionate brother." But affection couldn't bridge the moral chasm between them. Moses was determined to prosecute slave traders, including his own brother. John was equally determined to defend his right to participate in the trade. The conflict consumed years of their lives, played out in courts and newspapers, damaged the Providence Abolition Society, and delayed enforcement of anti-slavery laws. The story of the Brown brothers illustrates how slavery fractured American society at every level, even within families. It shows how economic interests could blind people to moral realities, how ideology could harden positions, how difficult change proved even when moral arguments seemed overwhelming. It also shows that change was possible. Moses Brown transformed from slave owner and slave trader into leading abolitionist. His conversion wasn't instantaneous. It took personal tragedy, religious conviction, and years of reflection. But he changed fundamentally, and he used his wealth and influence to fight the system he had once profited from. The Sally remains one of the best documented slave voyages in American history. The survival of Captain Hopkins's records, the Brown family correspondence, the business accounts, all provide unprecedented detail about how the slave trade actually functioned. Scholars continue studying these documents, extracting new insights about the economics, the logistics, the human cost. Of the 196 Africans Captain Hopkins acquired, we know almost nothing as individuals. We don't know their names, their African names were not recorded, and any names given them in slavery were imposed by captors. We don't know where precisely they came from, what languages they spoke, what families they left behind. We know only the circumstances of their captivity, and for 109 of them, the fact and sometimes the manner of their deaths. One woman hanged herself rather than continue the voyage. We don't know her name, her age, her story. We know only that moment of desperate agency, choosing death over slavery. 8 people died in the shipboard rebellion, shot by swivel guns when they fought for freedom. We don't know who organized the uprising, who struck the first blow, what they hoped to achieve. We know they tried and died trying. The 87 who survived to be sold in Antigua faced lives of enslavement in the Caribbean, back-breaking labor in cane fields, brutal punishments, early death. Some may have survived long enough to see abolition. Most probably didn't. These were the people whose lives funded the Brown family fortune, whose suffering made possible the elegant mansion on Power Street, whose labor produced the wealth that helped establish Brown University. Acknowledging this doesn't diminish the real achievements of the institution that bears the Brown name. Brown University has educated generations of students, produced groundbreaking research, contributed immensely to knowledge and society. The faculty and students of today bear no personal responsibility for the Sally voyage. But the connection exists. The wealth was real. The source of that wealth was human suffering. And the legacies of that suffering, economic inequality, racial injustice, the ongoing effects of generations of slavery, remain visible today. The Brown brothers' story offers no simple morals. Nicholas was cautious and civic-minded, but participated in the slave trade. Joseph was intellectually curious but withdrew silently rather than fighting the trade. Moses transformed into an abolitionist, but helped to create the textile industry that perpetuated slavery. John was a patriot who helped spark the American Revolution, but defended the right to enslave other human beings. They were not simple heroes or villains. They were complicated people making consequential choices in a complicated time. Some of their choices we can admire: their support for education, their civic contributions, their business acumen. Other choices we must condemn: their participation in slavery, John's violent defense of the slave trade, their willingness to treat human beings as cargo. The Sally's voyage stands at the center of their story. One ship, one voyage, 196 people, 109 deaths. It was the moment when abstract commerce became concrete horror, when profit and loss calculations confronted the reality of human suffering. For 3 brothers, that confrontation changed everything. For one brother, it changed nothing. The ship is long gone. The brothers are long dead. But their story continues to matter. It shows us how economic systems can normalize atrocity, how moral blind spots can persist in otherwise decent people, how families can fracture over fundamental questions of right and wrong. It also shows us that transformation is possible, that people can change, that institutions can confront their pasts honestly and try to do better. The grandfather clock that belonged to Captain Esek Hopkins still keeps time in University Hall. Every tick reminds us of the Sally's voyage, of the 4 brothers who financed it, of the 109 who died, of the moral reckoning that followed. Some wounds take generations to heal. Some debts can never be fully repaid. But remembering, honestly, completely, without flinching from uncomfortable truths, that's a beginning. The Brown brothers gave us that much. Through their Nicholas and John Brown, Moses and Joseph, 4 brothers who helped build Providence, who founded a university, who fought for American independence, and 4 brothers whose story reveals both the promise and the profound moral failures of the American founding.